So when you spoke to Iraqi scientists, what did they tell you about the active weapons program in the year leading up to the war?
They described from 1998 on a Iraq that was descending into the utter inability to do anything organized. Corruption was there. They couldn't get the equipment. Money was wasted. People weren't really concerned about working. They were concerned about money.
But the intent was there.
Absolutely. And the intent at the top of Saddam to acquire those weapons and to continue to attempt to acquire those was absolutely there.
You found that in 2000 and 2001, Saddam Hussein did actively try to develop and start a nuclear program.
He was putting more money into his nuclear program. He was pushing ahead his long-range missile program as hard as he could. Look, the man had the intent to acquire these weapons. He invested huge amounts of money, and the fact is, he wasn't successful.
So in terms of the missile program alone, you feel that it's obvious and undisputable that he violated UN resolutions by developing weapons, missiles that had a range outside of those UN resolutions?
Absolutely, Mac. We have collected dozens of examples of where he lied to the UN, violated Resolution 1441, and was in material breach.
So based on the information that you have, David, not what we had prior to the war, but you had, in your opinion, was it prudent to go to war? Was there an imminent threat?
I think it was absolutely prudent. In fact, I think at the end of the inspection process, we'll paint a picture of Iraq that was far more dangerous than even we thought it was before the war. It was of a system collapsing. It was a country that had the capability in weapons of mass destruction areas and in which terrorists, like ants to honey, were going after it.
Way around. The president described Iraq as a gathering threat, a gathering danger. Was that an accurate description?
I think that's a very accurate description.
But an imminent threat to the United States?
Tom, an imminent threat is a political judgment. It's not a technical judgment. I think Baghdad was actually becoming more dangerous in the last 2 years than even we realized. Saddam was not controlling the society any longer. In the marketplace of terrorism and of WMD, Iraq well could have been that supplier if the war had not intervened.
But as you know, the administration and its supporters not just suggest, but insist that there was a real connection between Saddam Hussein and terrorist organizations that would be a threat to the United States.
Look, I found no real connection between WMD and terrorists. What we did find, and as others are investigating, and we found a lot of terrorist groups and individuals that passed through Iraq.
Your findings indicate that Iraq had only a rudimentary chemical, biological, and nuclear program, and you've identified and you've said that that weapons of mass destruction related program activities. And I have to ask you, what does that mean? What are weapons of mass destruction related program activities?
That includes, for example, and take specific examples of the Iraqis, a program to develop a substitute for a major precursor for VX using indigenous production capability and indigenous chemicals so they would not have to import it. It includes a study, for example, on a simulant for anthrax. Pre-1991, their anthrax was liquid. They had tried to freeze dry it and get it down to the dry anthrax, which is stable, much more deadly lethal, as we found out here. By using this simulant, they actually pushed ahead about 2 generations by the production capability. Now, for this simulant, the same production capability that produces it is exactly the same that produces anthrax. So they, in fact, had moved ahead their anthrax capability by working on a simulant. And so it's in those areas that you get programmed. They had looked at the lethality of various agents and classified them. That's WMD-related work. I think, and I think I've said, but let me be absolutely clear about it, Iraq was in clear material violation of 1441. They maintained programs and activities, and they certainly had the intentions at a point to resume their program. So there was a lot they wanted to hide because it showed what they were doing that was illegally. I hope we find even more evidence of that.
Part of that program were missiles, clearly in defiance of the UN resolution in terms of range. They had the potential to incorporate in those warheads, although small quantities, nevertheless very lethal types of WMD. Am I not correct in that?
You're absolutely correct.
Could you say that the work thus far of the ISG, and I recounted a number of things, including the ricin and so forth, in my opening statement, does not that lend itself to the understanding, the conclusion that Saddam Hussein and this military machine under his control posed an imminent threat, perhaps to the neighbors, perhaps to those beyond the perimeter of the neighbors?
Senator Warner, I think the world is far safer with the disappearance and the removal of Saddam Hussein. I have said, I actually think this may be one of those cases where it was even more dangerous than we thought. I think when we have the complete record, you're going to discover that after 1998, it became a regime that was totally corrupt. Individuals were out for their own protection, and in a world where we know others are seeking WMD, the likelihood at some point in the future of a seller and a buyer meeting up would have made that a far more dangerous country than even we anticipated, with what may turn out not to be a fully accurate estimate.
Thank you, Dr. Kay. Senator Levin.
Although it now appears that Saddam, or at least so far appears that Saddam did not have large stockpiles of WMD, he did continue research on chemical and biological and even nuclear weapons, correct?
Absolutely.
Would you say then, Dr. Kay, that it was just a matter of time before Saddam would build such stockpiles or have that capability in a way that would threaten not only people in Iraq, but people in that neighborhood and perhaps others?
I think you will have, when you get the final ISG report, pretty compelling evidence that Saddam had the intention of continuing the pursuit of WMD when the opportunity arose, and that the first start on that, the long pole in the tent, was this restart of the long-range missile program.
You said something that, during your opening statement that intrigues me, and something that I'm afraid may be overlooked in all of this back and forth, and that has to do with proliferation. You said that there was a risk of a willing seller meeting a willing buyer of such weapons or weapons stockpiles, whether they be large, small, or programs, whether it's information that Iraqi scientists might be willing to sell or work in cooperation with rogue organizations or even nations. But do you consider that to have been a real risk in terms of Saddam's activities and these programs, the risk of proliferation?
I consider it a bigger risk than and that's why I paused on the preceding question. I consider that a bigger risk than the restart of his programs being successful. I think the way the society was going and the number of willing buyers in the market, that probably was a risk that if we did avoid, we barely avoided.
And indeed, that continues to be a concern we have today in the
Yes.
old Soviet Union and other places where
Pakistan,
other nations where they've had official weapons programs, biological, chemical, and nuclear. The risk of proliferation into the hands of terrorists like Al Qaeda and others. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct.
When you answered a question from Reuters, what happened to the stockpiles of biological and chemical weapons that everyone expected to be there, your answer was simple, quote, I don't think they existed. So what needs to be established here is that when we remove, at least I believe is your view, and certainly mine, that, as you just stated, America, the world, and Iraq is a far better and safer place with Saddam Hussein gone from power. And the sacrifice made by American citizens and that are serving and sacrificing today was not only worth it, but very important to the future of the Middle East and the world. Do you share that?
That's certainly true, Senator. I probably learned not to speak to wire reporters and even to watch out for senators who want one-word answers.
Yeah.
It tends to compress complex issues.
But you agree with the fundamental principle here that what we did was a justified and enhanced the security of the United States and the world by removing Saddam Hussein from power.
Absolutely.
Okay.